Very excited to have this panel today. The topic, as you know, is around looking at funding results and getting results in higher education. The panelists, as many of you know, are some of the most thoughtful and experienced leaders in the country on this topic. To my immediate left, Teresa Lubbers is the commissioner for higher education in Indiana. And Indiana has really been one of the leading states, really looking at how to drive both innovation, change, and excellence in post-secondary, and looking forward to hearing about the Indiana experience. Michael Reeser is the chancellor and CEO of the Texas State Technical College System, and that is also a very impressive statewide effort looking at how to better align technical colleges to career outcomes and to workforce and to earnings and employment, with lots of experience there. Really looking forward to hearing from the chancellor. And we've got Larry Miller, the dean of the School of Education and charter schools as well from Florida Southwestern State College, who's got an ability to help bridge lessons learned from K-12 and post-secondary, and a tremendous experience, insights to gather there. So we had a chance to do a prep panel on a call, and I was just learning, and my name is John Schnurr. I lead the nonprofit America Achieves and advise Mike Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies on his philanthropy both in K-12 and higher education, with some focus on workforce readiness. And when I had the prep call for this with these three panelists and the amazing folks from the team organizing the summit, I was blown away by the insight here, and I feel like when I've been looking around the country at higher education, how relatively new some of the insights are here about what's being learned and what the implications are for change and innovation and excellence elsewhere. So I know we've got a lot of expertise in the room too, but I just sat and listened on this call, and I'm looking forward to hearing opening remarks from the three panelists, and then I'm going to be jumping in with, after that, with a lot of questions to really get a conversation going, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So thank you all for being here, and thanks to the panelists, and let's start with Commissioner Lubbers.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I know you've had a great morning. I'm sorry that I missed the morning speaker, but the luncheon speaker was terrific, so we'll try to keep you interested and excited this afternoon about a topic that you may not consider on a regular basis. At least we're going to perhaps present it to you through a different lens. As was mentioned, I'm the Commissioner for Higher Education in Indiana, and we are about the business of changing a culture of a state where education beyond high school is valued at a level it was not needed in the past. And when you hear us say higher education, hear me say education and training beyond high school, not necessarily a four-year degree for everyone, but some sort of a quality credential beyond high school. So when we looked at how we have been rewarding colleges and universities in Indiana, we have done it the same way that you do it in K-12 for the most part, which has been primarily we have been paying for the number of students who would be there. And a little more than a decade ago, really starting in 2003, so we were really at the forefront of this movement, we collectively decided that it was time for us to pay for what we value. And that meant we needed to figure out what is it that we value in higher education, and then how do we build a system of paying for that based on what we value. So as you might imagine, the first part that's difficult is you have to collectively decide what that is. We have an attainment goal in Indiana, and I would venture to say that most of the states represented in the room do as well, and that is that 60% of Hoosiers would have a quality degree or credential beyond high school. We're at about 42% now, and we're making inroads, but we still have a long way to go. And so we knew we needed to do something different than we had done it in the past. And it seemed to us that the idea of looking at what you value would be the way to do it. So we have, over a period of time, and we can dig into this a little bit more deeply as we go along, but we have been doing this for over a decade. And basically in Indiana, when we say we pay for what we value, that means we need more students to complete what they have started. We need more of them to complete on time whenever possible. We need more of our students who are at risk, as we are indicated by the fact that they qualify for Pell. We need more to get degrees that really matter, and so we reward STEM degrees. We need more to persist when they're there, so we do momentum points along the way. And ultimately, that all rolls up into our attainment goals. And so we also knew that when we put a system together like this, it was going to be important to have buy-in from those who were going to make it happen. And so we worked collectively with our colleges and universities to make sure that they believed that regardless of their mission, and we have We have everything from open access community college to highly intensive research institutions to four-year comprehensives. So we have it all. And it had to be clear that based on your mission, you still had the opportunity to gain in that formula. And so you have to make sure that they believe that it's developed in such a way that they can, in fact, win. And then you have to be able to provide as much stability with that formula so that you're not changing it all the time. As you might imagine, you're talking about cohorts of students, and so it takes a while for them to adapt to those new metrics and then a while to be able to show it. We also think it's important that you don't do it based on a moment in time, but that you smooth that process, and we use 2-3-year rolling averages and a 6-year period of time. All of these are sort of the details that we can get into, but the goal was really to have metrics that measured what we valued in terms of what our colleges and universities were doing. I will mention as an aside, and it's not directly related to this, but not only do we pay for what we value in terms of the operations of the institutions, but we pay for what we value in terms of how we distribute money to the students as well. So we actually have converted most of our need-based programs into earned benefit programs. So the combination of the two allows us to be able to say with, I think, authenticity that the performance funding formula is working in Indiana, and we have in 5 years increased by 41% the number of degrees that have been granted, and we can talk about some other metrics as well.
By 41%?
Yes.
From what to what?
From the degrees from where we started, the delta for that period of time in 5 years, from 2000, that was a 2010 to 2015, and the numbers since then have been greater. Our biggest actual change has been in on-time completion, which is a really hard number to move. And the other thing to understand about the performance funding formula is it's layered on top. So you could get, an institution gets more money for graduating more students. They could get more money for graduating them on time. They could get more money for graduating more Pell students. They could get more money for getting STEM degrees. They could get more money for persistence. And so there is a way that you can actually look at this based on what you really want. The biggest bulk, about 85 to 95% of the money has been distributed on what we call the big three: change in degree, on time, and at risk. And so it's, you have to do it in partnership, but you have to really start with the discussion is, why would you do performance funding formula? What are you trying to move? What metrics? And do you believe that you will have the collective buy-in to do this? And if you do, it'll make a difference.
One quick follow-up question, and then we're going to go to the Chancellor. You briefly mentioned the second component, converting need-based aid into earned benefits. Would you mind just elaborating on that briefly?
Indiana actually ranks first in the Midwest and fourth in the nation in the distribution of financial aid, and we do that through our office. So we distribute in a state of $6.5 million, 6.5 million people, about $350 million a year in need-based aid. But we know that it's not just the granting of the money that matters, it has to be that those students are actually completing. Because even as generous as those programs are, students are still borrowing money. So what we did is we have worked again to make sure that we have certain things that students do to make it more likely that they will graduate. They get more money if they take 30 credit hours a year, for example. They still will get money if they don't, but they get more money if they're on time. They're going to graduate on time. We have a nearly 3-decade-old Promise program in Indiana where our students can sign up in 7th and 8th grade, and if they actually maintain a 2.5 grade point average and they have 12 activities that they do in high school, they can qualify to go to one of our schools, college, for free as a 21st Century Scholar. So, but the scholars were not always succeeding, and that's why we think it's important for there to be expectations tied to performance.
Great. Thank you so much. Chancellor Reeser.
Thank you very much. So I'll give you perspective on accountability funding from an institutional
Oh, the mic's not working?
Hello? Cool. Okay. I'll give you an institutional perspective, if I could. We went to accountability funding about 9 years ago. First, I'll tell you just a little bit about TSTC. Then I'll tell you about how the formula works in Texas for our technical system. And then if I still have time, I'll tell you a bit about some of the ramifications that have occurred within our culture and within our operations. So TSTC is the technical college system in Texas. We're accredited regionally by SACS, like the other schools. We are public. We are an open institution. We have 10 campuses across the state, and we complement the community college system because we focus solely on high-tech and high-demand programs. So our mission is very narrow, and that's really important to keep in mind because later when we talk about accountability funding for others, that mission is really important. So in Texas, school funding is driven by two variables: an activity variable that is multiplied times a funding rate variable. So before we went to accountability funding, it was how many contact hours do we generate in a particular period times the funding rate for contact hours, and that would drive our state funding. The community colleges continue to operate that way with some accountability layers, like Teresa was talking about, on top of that. Ours was switched in 2011 to a wholly outcomes-based system. We still have two variables. The first variable is what are the employment outcomes of our students times a funding rate. Now, it's important to understand that what this means is this formula is wholly blind to enrollment, it's wholly blind to the number of sections we teach, it's wholly blind to how many students graduate versus leave. It is solely based on what employment outcome occurs when a student leaves TSTC and goes to work in Texas. A good way to think about the way this works is, imagine instead of being a college, we're a placement agency. And when we put someone to work, their salary will drive the amount of commission we receive as a placement agency. That's exactly how our state funding is driven in Texas. And this started in 2011, and it continues to this day. Now, before we go on, I want to say this. We have a fundamental notion that organizations know exactly where their money comes from. They know exactly how to earn their money. And when we were on the contact hour system, we knew exactly how to maximize our state funding by maximizing the contact hours that we generated. What we've learned in the 8 or 9 years since going to this is how to maximize the yields in this area too. But in a second, I'll show you why it's better with this new formula. Here's some of the benefits of this formula. If you were a lawmaker or a citizen, you really like the fact that until a person gets a job, you aren't paying for TSTC. That's pretty cool. And if you were a student, you like the notion of going to a school that isn't going to earn their keep until you, the student, get a job. Another is it's paid in arrears. So the success has already been realized before the money is indicated in our formula. In fact, the folks who leave TSTC and go to work are measured for 5 full years in the workplace before they're indicated in the formula. So what that means is we need to make sure we've produced a high quality graduate that's going to not just get a job, but keep a job at a good wage. It's self-funding because the impact of that graduate has already occurred on the state treasury by the time the money flows back to us and so forth. Here's the really important part about it is, when we were paid on a census basis, our best interests were served by making every program as long as possible. Our best interests were served by keeping a kid in the seat as long as possible, regardless of what the actual workforce training needs were for the particular career that student sought. So our best interests were actually at odds with the student because what the student wants is to get in, get out, get a job, and start their life. So this method is really wonderful because the best interests of the institution have now been aligned perfectly with the best interests of the student and, incidentally, with the best interests of the state who pays the bill. So it's a really wonderful approach from that standpoint. So so what does it do? Well, as you can imagine, an organization will follow the money. Am I out of time?
No.
Okay. We'll follow the money. You can see our results. These data are old because we don't have the latest certified, but I do have uncertified data that shows that this trend has continued to grow. We've grown our number of graduates put into the workplace by 42% since the benchmark year of 2009, which is when the legislature first asked us to go to this. And the aggregate salaries of those graduates has grown 83% in a similar kind of time frame. The reason the salaries have grown is because in the time since 2011, when we began to change all this, we have aggressively begun to redo our program mix. Gone are the programs that resulted in jobs that were low paying, and in their place are new programs or expanded programs that a student can be assured are going to result in a great job. I'll give you a perfect for instance. Our hottest new program right now is the Power Lineman program. The average starting salary for this one-year certificate in 2017 was $85,000 in Texas. That's a one-year program. So that's a program we never would have put on the books before this system because it's a power lineman. What's the romance in that? What we did find is there's a lot of romance in power linemen because those are the squashbuckling heroes that put your power back on when the blizzard hits. But they are also particularly well paid. That's just one example. So what that's caused us as we tweak our program mix is we've begun to use scorecards. Now I apologize for this. This is actually a color chart that got aberrated in its move from a Mac to a PC. So this is a scatter plot of our various programs, and what it shows is it shows the what we call the Program Vitality Index. All of our programs have published public data within the college atmosphere so that they can see how their program stacks up against all the other various programs in both employee earnings and contribution margin. This will, if you have a program that costs $10 to deliver a $1 job, you're going to show up on this. On the other hand, if you produce graduates who go to work for minimum wage, you're going to show up on here too. So this made public discussion about program mix a thing that was easy to do. Here's another example of a scorecard. This is, I believe this is diesel equipment. Yes, it is. This is one of our hot programs right now, diesel equipment. In fact, this program and 5 others are now in the brand new money back guarantee program. If a student signs up for this program or one of the other 5 core programs and can't get a job within 6 months of graduation, we refund 100% of their tuition. So the families that are sitting around the kitchen table trying to decide if they're going to risk the notion of going to college, particularly if they borrow money, know that if they don't achieve the outcome they're looking for, they'll get their money back. So in the past, we designed programs that were based on what would the kids sign up for. So we had programs like, cosmetology and things that had a bit of sex appeal to them. But the truth is, those are minimum wage dead ends. So what we replaced them with was a process like this that put high value programs on the books. And what that means is whatever the appetite the student may be for a program at our college, we know that at the end they're going to have a really great employment outcome when they get to the end of the program. And that's my comments.
Great. Eager to go more in depth. Let me ask 1 or 2 quick questions
Yeah.
based on what you shared. One is, the chart showed helpfully variability in terms of the outcomes you're getting across programs, which always is the case, and you're measuring that and you're driving toward more improvement. What have you learned from that variability when you look today at the various programs in terms of their effectiveness, the ones that are really doing well on your metrics and not as well? What's explaining the difference, and how are you handling addressing that?
So we have a great benefit in the technical realm that most of our faculty don't come from the academy, they come from the workplace. They come out of industry. So we have folks who typically are used to the notion of getting out of bed every morning and making a living. What this has allowed us to do is to tap into that entrepreneurial nature that our faculty learned when they were in industry. They know about the idea of return on investment and spending or prioritizing your scarce resources toward the ultimate goal of student success. And so we've begun tapping into that, and our program chairs are turning into line of business managers who use that entrepreneurial spirit to attack a marketplace and constantly review what they're doing and whether it contributes positively to student success.
And just one quick follow-up on that. So in the variability, some of the programs are doing exceptionally well on the metrics. Some of your own programs, when you look at it, are not doing as well. When you look at what seems to be causing the difference between those that are doing very well versus not in your own system, what are you seeing as the factors that drive that?
What we do is we sit down with faculty and we look at what are the causes for the performance in the low quadrant, is what we refer to it. That's the lower left quadrant. What are the causes of this? Is it because you happen to be in an industry that just pays poorly? Or is it because your costs are inherently too high? Or are there operational techniques you could use to move your program to the upper right? And moving your program toward the upper right is the performance effort that they have learned. We've learned you have to be patient because the moves occur slowly, but eventually, when it's quite clear that a program is not likely to progress to the upper right, then we close the program.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to that. Dean Miller.
Yes. Well, thank you, and thank you to my co-panelists. I've learned a lot just sitting here. I was taking notes from both of you. I'm up here today to speak as both a researcher, and I collaborated with Matthew Joseph, who's sitting right up here. We wrote the toolkit and model that's on your chairs. As reference, there's a website that provides more details to go with that. But I'm also here as a leader of an institution of higher ed that had performance funding done to him. So I'm going to speak about what these guys did to us and how we responded. So I'll switch back and forth between the two hats. Just to be clear, on the research side, we reviewed a lot of the literature, and that's summarized in the papers. I won't get into it too much, except to say that early on, there didn't seem to be much of a relationship between performance funding and student learning outcomes. More recent evidence has suggested there are large positive impacts from performance funding on student learning outcomes. I'll point you to the work from Research for Action. If anyone from that organization is here, they've done some excellent work. Also, in Florida, there's a study I dug up that was done by the Yale Center for the Study of the Child in collaboration with the Lassinger Center at the University of Florida. It's a really solid study, 200 pages in length, on performance funding for early learning. And I think it's important to bring up here because oftentimes we're at a conference where we're talking about, transitioning higher ed, performance funding in higher ed to K-12, and people get worried about younger learners. But in Florida, we saw a 78% increase in student learning outcomes for early learners. So why can't our K-12 system take advantage of those gains as well? So I am gonna, let me hit this slide and see. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so I just want to talk first about my institution. So when performance funding came, and this is very different from Mike's system, we only have performance funding in Florida for the state colleges. It represents about 1% of our total revenue, so nowhere near the 100% that you guys have. But we responded by developing a new set of strategic priorities that we termed Dedicate to Graduate. You may have said we should have had those priorities before, but nevertheless, this is what we arrived at after performance funding was implemented. That led us to change our practices, including a major investment in new academic advisors. We basically doubled the number of staff there and increased the credentials required for all those folks. We also started doing some data mining for graduates, and it turns out we were able to find lots of students who had completed college completion CCCs, certificates, as well as potentially degrees that they were unaware of. And so we were awarding those degrees and certificates to them. And we've gotten much better at linking that data mining project to our advisors. As a result, our graduation rate is up 14%. So I think, it's safe to conclude from both our experience as well as the early learning experience that in Florida, performance funding, the juice at least is worth the squeeze there. But I do want to caution you in our state, and as you think about doing this in your own state, I have the good fortune to lead a school of education that has 2 collegiate charter schools that are ranked number 1 and 4 in the state. I have a teacher prep program that was ranked number 3 in the state with an 87% graduation rate and 100% job placement rate. So for my institution, my specific school in my college, we didn't pay attention to really any of this because we were already heading at home. And so some of you may say, well, you weren't supposed to be affected by it. But I would say, let's caution ourselves against ceiling effects. And that's something just to food for thought. I'm going to transition now and just talk a little bit about translating performance funding from higher ed into the K-12 space. So I want to talk about New Hampshire because New Hampshire, I think, has the best and most fully implemented example of performance funding in K-12 in the nation. They did something really innovative there. So when they started VLAX, that's their online charter school, their statewide charter school, they started it with a performance funding system in place. So very innovative, but also what was nice about it is they started with performance funding as opposed to what we're hearing from my colleagues up here, putting that system in place after the system's been up and running for a long time. So they kind of avoided some of the implementation challenges that others might face. So very unique system. They no longer are funded on seat time. They are now funded on the percent of assignments students complete. So they didn't want to go all the way to graduation rates, for instance, like we're hearing about in higher ed, but they didn't want to be funded on seat time instead. 100% of their funding is allocated based on the percent of assignments that are completed. So in their model, it's completion for funding, and they are a competency-based state. So competencies are for credit. So they separate those 2 ideas in their model. And I want to just share one slide, and there's a paper that's cited in there. You can read more about their model. I like to highlight this chart because it's something we don't talk a lot about, but the green line that you're looking at there shows VLAX funding under completion-based funding. The blue line is what the system would have been funded at had they been funded under a seat time funding model. So you can see they're getting less than half of the revenue they would get from the state. Now it's important to note here that we did a fiscal health analysis of the system. They're very fiscally healthy. They're investing significant resources in direct student instruction. I might also note they aren't facing some of the problems that Arizona, Colorado, and Ohio are. No one's making $10 million compensation packages there either. And I bring this up not because I want policymakers in the room to try to find a way to save money. I want to say this is what they're earning right now, and their CEO and their team is comfortable with that. And now we can have a conversation about how do we move the green line to the blue line based on actual student learning outcomes and not based on seat time, which is what we used to do in the past. So ultimately, I think the takeaway from New Hampshire is that going to something like what the system Mike talked about might be a little too hot for them. The old model of seat time funding was a little bit too cold. and they kind of hit their Goldilocks zone right in the middle there with completion-based funding. So it's a model worth looking at. My takeaway from this work is not that I want you to think that New Hampshire's model is right for your state. It depends on what your state's strategy is. This works for New Hampshire. Your state's going to have its own set of performance outcomes that you've got to select. What Matthew and I tried to do was build a simulation tool at the back of the handout you have there to walk you through the decision process of designing your own performance funding system for your K-12 schools. And I just want to wrap up with a few considerations for policymakers. I think one of the most important ones is that the longer-term outcomes, longer-term performance outcomes appear to have less influence over student outcomes in a higher ed setting. This is something that's been borne out in the research. So, of course, what we're hearing from Mike here today is that those long-term 5-year outcomes are strongly related to the programs he offers, but I'm just speaking in general about the 500 plus studies or so we reviewed. So I think it's important in a K-12 setting for state leaders to think about incorporating nearer-term performance indicators that teachers and school administrators feel like they have more of a direct influence over. The second point I want to make is that schools respond initially as intended to the shock of performance funding, but the effect seems to decay over time. We see this in Eric Hanushek's work on other high-stakes accountability systems. So you may want to consider, if you're starting out at a lower percentage, adding automatic escalators so the percentage of funding that's allocated based on performance rises over time. And then finally, and this is the biggest problem we need to talk about in this room, is that it appears that at-risk students are not benefiting from performance funding the way that other students in the system are. I don't see anyone in the literature, and that doesn't mean it's not happening in practice, but we would like to see states weight their allocations so that if an at-risk student meets the performance requirements set, the institution receives extra funding for that performance. And I will leave it there. I will say just in closing that these are complex systems to put in place, but Matthew Joseph and his team at ExcelinEd are here to provide technical assistance. So if you're interested after this presentation, come see us. Thanks.
So a conversation's about to begin. Before I even ask questions, I can see and I'd love to get reactions from other panelists.
Well, thank you. I think what's clear is that outcomes-based funding looks different in different contexts. And so you've heard 3 sort of different takes on this. There are about 30 states that are now doing performance outcome-based funding in higher education, from an institution doing it, which is a technical school like that, to full systems like Ohio that are doing 100%. And then you'll have a system like Indiana, which actually has been much more evolutionary in its process. So we started in 2003 with 1% that was based on one metric that really wasn't a direct student success metric. It was if the institution was able to draw down more research dollars, for example. It became clear to us that what we really wanted to do with performance funding was to build it all around student success. And so those metrics changed over a period of time. And so we have changed the percentage. So we went from 1 to 3 to 5 to 6.5%, which is where we are now, advocating for 7 and 8% in this upcoming session. Just to give you some perspective, the operating budgets for Indiana, the operating budgets, not all in higher ed, the operating budgets over 2 years are about $2.3 billion, of about $143 million have been allocated on performance dollars. But we've done this long enough now with a commitment to do all new dollars and actually to reallocate a portion of the base as well, because we don't know how much new money we're going to get. But if performance matters, it has to matter during all times. And so we've reallocated the base. So about 1/4 to 1/3 of the base budgets of our institutions have now been impacted and reallocated based on performance metrics. By doing this in sort of an evolutionary way, you can acknowledge the different missions of the institutions and their ability to meet those needs of students going forward. I would also offer in a little bit of a challenge to what was just said is that I think more and more of the performance funding formulas do in fact drive more money to at-risk students, and certainly ours would do that in Indiana, as we drive more money if they're Pell dollars, if they're Pell students, we drive additional money if they're Pell and they graduate on time, so we put an extra premium on that for Pell students. So we in fact, in keeping with paying for what we value, knowing we can't get to our attainment numbers that we want without dealing with the equity and achievement gap issues in our state, we actually put more money on that. And I think that you're finding more states doing that. The other thing that was clear to me in listening to both them and knowing that the audience is primarily a P-12, although some actually the transitions certainly between high school and college matter to you as well. It's, what are the similarities and what are the differences between the sectors in higher ed? And I would say that there are some difference. I would say that the mission differentiation in higher education means that you sometimes have to design those metrics differently for the different schools. Certainly a labor outcome metric does matter, and we've actually included that as a part of ours. Getting more students to graduate and graduate on time matters, and that's one that we would do as well. So I think that's a little bit different. But I think the on-time metric is a little different. Yes, you don't have all of your students graduating on time, but I don't think you're as focused on that expense that's related to staying in college longer and trying to get people to graduate on time. Having said that, I do think there are a lot of similarities, and that would be, this whole concept of, valuing people completing high school with a degree that actually sets them in place. If they're going straight into the world of work, for example, what have you done in career and technical education that mattered to them when they went on and got a job? I think student success matters in both of these sectors. I think the achievement gap issues matter in both of our sectors, and we have to deal with that. I think setting our attainment goal is a goal that actually is married to both K-12 and higher ed in our states. So the goal at the end of the day isn't to get students to graduate from high school or to get students to graduate from college. It is to get them to have a meaningful career in life. And that means that there has to be alignment. And so I think there is a lot of similarity.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. So I'm going to have a series of relatively rapid-fire questions.
Okay.
I'd love to get through a fair amount of content. And so there's such insight. I wish we had 4 hours, but we only have about, about 20 minutes or so. So I may interrupt in the middle, and then we'll go to questions from the audience after. So the goal here, of course, is shared as student success. I'd love to go a little beneath the hood and Chancellor and then Commissioner, for the two you comment on, give us a little vivid sense of how you think the systems you got in place are driving the better outcomes. Like, what is it that actually happens when you set you're paying for what you value? What is it that actually happens, maybe even in the case of giving an example of an institution or a program that is actually changing or getting created that gets better results because of the system that's been in place?
I can give you some examples of that. And this is really important, is a workforce college like us really has such a narrow mission. We don't do research, we don't create new information, we are not the academy, we are trainers of skilled workforce. So the benefit we have is that singular focus. This system allowed, an example is the diesel program. When we were trying to maximize contact hours, the only outcome we had available in the diesel program was an associate degree. So the students would come and they would labor through an associate degree, even those who, because life was happening to them, needed to get to the workplace quickly. Well, when this program came along, what faculty discovered was there are some really high-paying jobs available to kids who just do brakes, transmissions, and power plants. And that's all they do. So we created a myriad of sub-degree credentials, exit points for kids that can go straight to the workplace, and we vetted them through the employers. So we had a whole covey of employers who were standing waiting to hire these graduates as soon as they completed those 3 components. And so we were able to provide successful pathways to kids who otherwise may not have completed an associate degree because they were in a hurry.
That's a great example. Two quick follow-ups, then I'm going to go to the commissioner and then come back to the dean for comments on this. That's a great example in terms of a program. Who drove that? Like, what level was that decision driven to create those sub-degree credentials that was ultimately get more aligned to the job hiring needs and earnings? And also on the equity point, what do you know in that case about the outcomes by type of population, low income, learners of color, et cetera?
So the faculty drove it, and the faculty drove it because we sat down and explained to them how their overall vitality scores could be improved by creating pathways for kids that were fast and inexpensive, but resulted in a good job. And faculty know exactly where those jobs are and could create the pathways that went there. And then regarding disadvantaged kids, most of our kids already are.
By the way, it's a very interesting example because sometimes when one thinks of performance funding, you think, okay, well, this happens and therefore the state or some large institution says we're going to modify this. And sometimes it can seem, or could be, at odds with, hey, we're leveraging the expertise in the front lines. It is an interesting example of how you're saying that empowered the faculty to figure out how to accomplish that goal.
Well, we actually intend for that to get turbocharged too. Starting next year, we're in the midst of developing with them a compensation package that works kind of like a profit sharing plan, so that faculty who are able to drive the performance of their program higher will actually share in terms of bonus programs. And that will be in lieu of the old-fashioned notion of overload.
And sorry, and then I interrupted, but the follow-up on outcomes by demographic and equity.
We are already, we're a Hispanic serving institution, and we are a white minority institution, and from the standpoint of Pell and low and moderate income students, a preponderance of our students are already challenged, kids that come from challenged backgrounds.
And when you look at this as an example, or when you look at the alignment more toward degrees, do you see any lessons learned in terms of how these changes are specifically benefiting those learners who are most in need?
Well, there's two factors that are really important here. The first is cost. For families that have to borrow money to go to school, you want to get through as quickly as possible, and the shorter the program, the cheaper it is. So there's that. Number two is, a lot of times, kids who come from low to moderate income are helping to support a family back home, or they otherwise have to work. And so speed to completion and really efficient pathways are more attractive to them than trying to check out of life for 2 years to go do a college
Thank you so
degree.
much, so helpful. Commissioner, was there an example in Indiana of how this has actually led to sort of specific on-the-ground or program change getting better results?
Well, there are multiple examples of which I know I have limited time, so I will just talk about two. One, if you look at the on-time metric for completion, we've actually changed the way that we've talk about staying on time. So we ran a big campaign called 15 to Finish. A lot of students were thinking that when they were taking 12 credit hours, because that's considered full-time by Pell, that they were actually on time to graduate, and they weren't. So we actually have changed and the schools were charging the same, if you took more than 15, you were paying more. So now they've moved to banded tuition, where between 12 and 18 credit hours, you pay the same amount of money in most of our institutions. We ran a big campaign, 15 to Finish. The schools know that they're going to get more money if they get people to finish on time, and the result is that more students are graduating on time. A second example that I would give would be just all the number of programs that we have that are bridge programs now for students entering college. So they're in learning communities, they are having mentors, they are going in bridge programs, they're having first semester course work that's actually designed to make sure that they're picking the right major. All of the things that we know are making it more likely that they will persist and graduate from college. So the financial part must be undergirded by the policies and programs that actually incent the right kinds of behaviors.
And the comment the Dean made earlier on equity and looking at impact by population, what have you seen in terms of impact for low-income, moderate-income learners of color, underserved students?
We are finding that it is making a difference. I will say that for students, our 21st century scholars, who are our first generation students of color, they are graduating from college at a higher level than their low-income peers. And in many places, at Purdue, for example, this last year, our 21st century scholars actually exceeded the population at large with completion rates, which is incredible. We would like to see that happen every place. But so you're starting to see that. We just did an equity report in Indiana that shows that for our low-income minority non-scholars, we are not making the same progress that we are making with our 21st century scholars.
Larry, having heard those, you made some points earlier about what findings you're seeing. What would you say about your findings in relation to what you just heard?
Well, I think that's great progress in those cases. Nationally, we don't see that, the effect on disadvantaged students as much as we're seeing in the two states and programs we're talking about today. And I would just say I like the idea that weighting is happening because if the performance isn't leveling out the way we expect it to, we can change the conversation in capitals to say, let's ramp that weight up even farther until we hit the number that we want to see so that everyone's achieving at the same rates. And that's a different conversation than we have in capitals right now.
And one follow-up question for you, Larry, on your earlier points. You made a point, could you elaborate on your first of your three final research findings that you said like long-term
long-term outcomes
did not seem to relate to student learning outcomes or success outcomes. Could you share more what you mean by that and what the implications are?
There's sort of in the performance management literature, there's two arguments. That performance management 1.0 was tied to learning outcomes like graduation rates, job placement rates, those sorts of things. In the new literature, they call it new performance management or performance management 2.0. Shorter term outcomes where folks feel like they have more of a direct connection and more control over how a student performs on a given performance measure. There was a stronger relationship between performance funding and student outcomes. So for instance, like the example I gave earlier, if an instructor at VLAX is sort of their performance measure is the percentage of assignment students complete, they have a lot of control and influence over that performance measure. But if it's the graduation rate of the student for the whole school and I teach English, I feel like I have a lot less influence and control over that outcome. So, that's what the literature is pointing to.
I mean, I'll come back to this, but partly it depends on your theory. You're trying to change the individual behavior or more of a team-wide or institution-wide behavior. But
could I respond to that?
Please.
I'd like to. We've used a metaphor that's been really helpful. In the past, when we were paid on contact hours, we like to say we were on straight salary. Today, we're on straight commission. Mm-hmm. We don't get a nickel till we put a kid to work, and that the higher their salary, the more we make. And we know every bit of our future is based on that. You take and begin to blend that where you have a base salary and then a little bit of kicker and stuff like that, and you begin to water down the real impact that accountability funding is going to have. You have to bet the ranch, or you have to nearly bet the ranch, if you really want behavior to change. And what I would suggest is if we went back and looked at all these historical studies, what we'd find is there are schools who stuck their toe in the water and just put a little bit at risk. Mm-hmm. You put it all at risk, and you get up every day bound and determined to get students through.
Commissioner and Larry.
Yeah, I would just add that I was a legislator for 17 years too, and I can tell you, having heard the colleges and universities come to make their appeal for 2 or 3% more money in their budgets, any time that all of their new money and a portion of their base is going to be allocated on performance metrics, it matters. Now, when there is a situation where there is a direct tie to someone leaving a certificate program, going into the world of work, there is a more direct way to measure that. And so what I guess this says is the complexity of performance funding must be done in a contextual way, but it has to matter. It has to matter at the end of the day if you're going to drive behaviors. If you talk to the 7 public school presidents of the schools in Indiana right now, and you ask them if they thought performance funding mattered, they will bank everything on being able to win in the performance funding formula because that's where their money is coming from. And so I think it has to matter to them, and I think it does.
Larry, did you have a response?
Yeah,
quickly?
I do have a response. And I think I agree in general with both what you guys are saying. You've got to have skin in the game to make this matter. But I do run a program for early childhood educators. So I want to challenge Mike for a second to say, you know, those are important jobs, right? Educating early learners. We have a kindergarten readiness gap problem in this country. So how do we get good teachers in that field and get them to stick and stay is a big challenge in my community and across the country. You know, James Heckman's work says that that's the most important investment we make and has the highest ROI of any form of spending we have on educating our population, yet we spend very little on it. So that aside, Mike, my grads make $9.95 an hour. So under your model, I would eliminate that program. And I'm not against eliminating programs. I've done it myself. But how would you respond to this one?
So I would respond this way. My narrow mission is high-tech, high-demand, middle skills jobs. That's all I am charged to do. And that narrow mission justifies a very narrow and employment-based metric. That's okay. I wouldn't dream of applying our model to a comprehensive community college. I wouldn't do it to a university. The really important lesson here is what Teresa talked about, and that is pay for what you value. Our model of using salaries is appropriate for us, but the value of an early childhood teacher can't possibly be demonstrated in their salary. There's no way it could. So you have to develop a different value that you pay for.
It is a really interesting principle that you shared, and you're really underscoring is pay for what you value, and that having that different types of schools, systems, institutions may warrant different types of things that you focus on based on the mission. I think that is an important point that often I think does get lost. One question I wanted to follow up and then maybe open up quickly to a couple of questions. It does seem what we've heard from Indiana and Texas relied on a pay for what you value at the kind of institutional level, the program level first. Now, I know you, Commissioner, you said now you're getting to the compensation for individuals too, but it seems from what I heard, the focus on how do you change institutions' programs rather than the theory that I heard you express at least being how do you change the individual behavior of particular individual faculty, at least at first. And I'm wondering, and then I heard Larry say there's some research to show that for individuals being motivated, that things that are more under their control, like shorter term metrics matter more than longer term metrics. And I think there's just different theories here about, is the theory about institutional change and program change, is it about individual change, and where do you start? And I'm curious if anyone who would like to comment on that would comment on what you think you've learned from the work you've done and seen.
Well, we've sort of flipped the model, and it's not that institutions haven't always cared about students, but we've now have, the guiding principles that we have been to build a student-centered, mission-driven, workforce-aligned system of higher education. And that means the student is at the center. That means our performance metrics are all about student success. That means the faculty must adapt their policies to making sure students are more successful. Now, having said that, the reality is it's one thing to have this plan and this formula. It's another at the institutional level to make it actually real and alive and have the results that you want, which means they have to have a buy-in to it as well. So we have done this, every time we consider a change, we meet with every institution, we talk about the impact, we look at the numbers, we give them the opportunity to provide feedback to us. We've changed in response to that sometimes, but we've held true to the basic philosophy, which is that performance funding is about student success and that we must all circle around the student, not the student figure out how to meet the needs of the institution.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that college presidents are drawn in lots of areas. So lots of people want their time and want to direct their efforts to their agendas. And so I think performance funding, when it's focused on institutional outcomes, really helps narrow that agenda on what voters and state legislators want them to focus on. And that's important. And that's valuable work. And that's the number one thing to focus on first. But I do think, so the answer to your question, John, is I think it's both. We also have to motivate our frontline employees as well. And so sort of a nuanced system that incorporates both performance measures would probably get us the biggest bang for our buck.
And it is interesting, if pay for what you value might be different for an institution or program to an individual, and that could have bearing. All right, kind of a couple questions. Yes, please, in the third row.
First, thank you all for being here. I learned quite a bit. Dr. Mill, I got a question for you, though.
Sure.
So if the model was dealing with Georgia, oh, I'm not yelling loud enough.
No, I hear you.
1, 2, 13, 74.
It's on.
Great. We can hear you.
So your model, though, dealt with only charter schools in Georgia, I believe, or does it deal with all public schools, K through 12, in Georgia?
I'm sorry, I talked about Florida and New Hampshire. So in the K-12 space,
I'm sorry, I
yeah,
said Georgia, I meant
yeah,
Georgia.
that was a charter school in New Hampshire. Thank you for pointing that out.
If it's very, if it works well for
Mm-hmm.
those charter schools, why would it not work well for all public schools? And if it would,
Yeah.
then why isn't anyone doing it?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's something I should have addressed early on. This is, in the K-12 space, we're really cutting edge. Higher ed has been working at this for a long time, so we don't know very much. I brought up the VLAC study, which was born out of, I was doing work on personalized learning, the cost of personalized learning nationally, and this was a model I stumbled across in that study and wanted to dig into it more, so then we ended up writing a separate paper on their model. But we just don't see a lot of it in the brick and mortar space, so it's not just transitioning from charter to district operated, it's also transitioning from virtual to brick and mortar. But I do think the virtual space offers all the states here who have virtual charter schools an opportunity to revise their formula and implement something like a performance funding model in that space.
Just given limited time, I'm going to ask a couple hands here in the fourth row, and then 2 in the first row. If you could just ask your question briefly, and then let's actually hear all the last questions briefly, and then we'll give the panelists a final chance to respond.
When you pay for performance, or is there any evidence or research where the schools relax standards in order to get the better performance just to get the money?
And let's hold responses for that while we get the last couple questions.
So I can tell you, in our case, no.
Sorry, we're going to just
Oh,
wait.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, we're just going to have a couple last questions asked in the first row. We had a hand up, and then we'll have you, the panelists respond to any of the last questions that you like.
This question is probably for Teresa. Just curious whether you differentiate among your institutions, your larger institutions versus your regionals.
Great. I think we had one last hand over here.
Thank you, panelists. Great discussion. Have you found that performance pay at higher ed causes the higher ed system to talk a little bit more with the K-12 system, so the transition is more seamless?
So let me do this, just in the interest of time. Ask each of the panelists to make a brief closing comment, and you feel very free, I think, to address one of the questions that just came up as part of that. Chancellor or Commissioner?
I'll go if you want. First, with regards to quality, what I'll say is when you are placing students in the workplace, you can't afford to just place one student with each company. If you put a bad product out in the marketplace, that employer will never be back to hire graduate number 2. And the fact that then the graduates are measured for 5 years indicates that our quality is really good because of the stability of their earnings. With that in mind, I'll say this in a closing remark is if accountability is something that you think schools ought to be subject to, what I will say is choose carefully what you want them to be accountable for. And the best programs will tie, obviously, back to the mission of the school. If you have a complex, broad mission, hold them accountable for the whole thing. Otherwise, you'll just get selective performance. If you have a narrow mission, use narrow. Keep it simple.
Thank you. Commissioner?
I'll respond to the question here. First of all, I think it's important that when you look at performance funding the way we've done it, it's based on improvement. So it is not a blunt number compared to another institution. It's the improvement that that institution makes. Having said that, you have a pie of money that's going to be distributed, so there are winners and losers. So some of the metrics apply across the board to all kinds of institutions. Some apply to only some institutions based on their mission. In some states, they have a separate formula, performance funding formula, for example, for community college than from four-year institutions. So it depends on how you do those, but it's important to know that this is an improvement model. So you are rewarded based on improvement.
Thank you. Larry?
Couple brief comments. One, on the cheating piece, I don't see, I haven't heard any high stake stories about that, but I have heard about political lobbying that takes place to change the performance funding rules. So if you want to call that cheating, that's what I think of it as. You know, and that just happened recently in Florida, and I won't name institutions, but we don't have a bottom rung anymore. That got eliminated for universities. As far as the K-12 and higher ed talking more, and I kind of live in both those worlds, so I can say that I think that in Florida, we're starting to just have that conversation now because we do very much now care about the product that's coming out of K-12 if we're going to be performance funded on that. So this should, and I'd like to hear from Indiana, maybe that they're farther ahead than we are. And the last thing I'll just say is that what does invoke the most conversation in Florida, at least between higher ed and K-12, and this is a little off subject, is our dual enrollment funding formula where we share money and the money follows the student. And so that model lets us talk a lot more. Thank you.
This has been a very insightful panel, and I do think that the pay for what you value and really understand what the mission is and what stakeholders care about in the mission, having that drive, the metrics is important. The keep it simple, knowing that there are complicating principles, prioritizing what are the few things that you most want to manage and control for is key. Also, clearly there's a multiplicity of approaches here, and I would say from what we've heard, it seems like there are efforts that are working and some that aren't, and sometimes people are like, oh, we're pro this or pro that. The devil's in details here, and so just the notion of, hey, paying for success or performance by itself probably isn't a good idea or bad idea. The key is how it's done. And I'm also struck, just from a K-12 perspective, if we had more time, I'd be interested in going into it, that I would say nationally there's been more effort, I feel like, expended on rewarding individual educators in some cases than rewarding school-wide program institutions. And it was interesting to me in this discussion that lessons from post-secondary, at least in these cases, have started more with the program-wide institution than maybe going to the individual rather than the reverse, and that's an interesting implication for K-12 as well. There's so much more to cover in this, but given the time, I just want to ask everyone to give a huge hand to this terrific panel. Thank you so much.